Welcome to Leaping the Abyss, a set of 7 podcasts hosted by Gail and Matt Taylor designed to help listeners think about their own agency and world perspective, and how individual ideas, values, actions, and beliefs help to shape and give life to the emerging paradigm, by design or default. Each of the 7 podcasts has a different interviewer, each familiar with the particular subject being explored. These roughly 30-minute interviews are more questions than answers, more nudging than perspective. For our 3rd episode of the series, please welcome Jesko Vandensteinen and the topic, So What Happens Then?
Hello, Matt and Gail. This is episode 3. The title that we're working with is What Happens Then? My name is Jesko Vandensteinen. I'm based currently in Hong Kong and Macau. And for most of my life, I've been an actor, and I'm a recovering actor. I now work doing complex problem solving with a large consultancy here in Hong Kong and Macau. I am going to stop talking about me and let's get focusing on the matter at hand. Matt and Gail, welcome. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Of course, currently the whole world is readjusting and coming to terms with a new reality that I think 3 months ago was a space for strategists and clinicians thinking about what could happen in the world of a pandemic. And several new realities have opened since then. And considering that this is an episode where we focus more about what will happen and what can we do when we think of the future, and how can we manifest that new reality? I want to ask you guys a question regarding, you've been through full cycle over the last 30, 40 years of talking about future and how people can work better together and how people can design and manifest their futures. There's a great axiom which has been heard a lot in your work, is that you can't get to there from here, but you can get to here from there by bringing some of the aspects of your vision of here and forward projecting. Can you share with us some of your core thinking around this idea of future projecting and how can we do that in our daily lives?
Well, first off, people do have a vision of the future. That's really unavoidable. It may not be clear to them. It may not be something they thought through and tested, but we all have expectations, and sometimes it's just a default. It's not necessarily something that they thought through, designed, or worked with other people to cause to happen in some way. And so that's the first thing that's important. The second thing is that you have to model the future. You have to build models of it. You have to think about it. You can read a lot because there's a tremendous amount of literature, and there has been in my entire lifetime, people modeling, designing the future, thinking about the future. It's a tremendous library of information, but it's often ignored or just taken as, well, just for granted. And so when you think about the future, model it, you can then test it. If this part of my model is true, then I need to be seeing this, this, and this, and this before it, because you can't do this without this in some way. And our scientists or industrialists or innovators or anybody building this kind of infrastructure in order to deal with this or not. And after a while, and if you work with it, when you work with people, whether you're an educator, whether you're a planner or whatever, if you always start with that future model and then work back to where you are and bring some of the best things you want back to that and build it into your plan, you are then starting to create a future by design, not default.
What would be a model in the opus of your guys' work? There are a number of models. What would be a model that you would point someone to who is thinking about the future and wanting to work backwards?
It's the modeling language, actually, when we look at all of them together, I guess best case, worst case would be one of those models where we would look at what is the best case you can think of and what is the worst case. Well, we try and bracket them wide enough and open enough so that there's lots of room for many things to happen. And it's not we're trying to create one future by any stretch of the imagination. But then you can and then if you bring that there back to here, you can begin to model how you're doing, and you can begin to see steps to take. And I think it's taking tiny steps toward that future that gives people a sense of, I can do this. I can find, once you start on that path, I think it's fairly simple to fill it out.
In your experience, guys, you've been working on this for a period of time, and you've worked with a lot of people. What is some of the biggest errors that you've seen people make about thinking of the future, or some of the common trappings that people will fall into?
One, I think they break the past, the future, and the present into 3 separate categories. And the present is very tiny. It's like maybe 5 years. And to us, the present is the last 5 years and the next 5 years as present. Really, those are the things happening. Minimum, mm-hmm. Yeah. And so until we, by nature, start looking at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, we can't see the patterns emerging. We can't find where ideas began and how they've evolved, as Matt talks about in Weak Signal. Unless you have that broader framework, you don't know where ideas came from. It's hard to see, and therefore it's hard to say. It's difficult to let our imaginations wander and explore and play with ideas. We're trapped in the present.
Yeah, Gail mentioned patterns. The past and the past and futures would become futures, which become the past for when you get there and go beyond. There's many, many repeating patterns over and over. And at the end of World War I, when they finally created the final peace treaty and everything, virtually everybody on every side stepped away and said, "We'll see you in 20 years." They just knew that it was going to happen again because of the incompleteness and the unfairness of the way some of the treaties worked out. And so you see a lot of repeating patterns. And I agree with Gail entirely. Your model isn't just of the future. It should go back, whatever your subject area is, it should go back as far as you can find good information about. See what the patterns were in the models, what tends to repeat, what tends not to repeat, what you want to do differently. And then when you look at your idealized future and your possible worst case, and things start to happen, you can have feedback. And you look at the feedback, and then you can take actions to move things more towards that goal that you have. And that goal could be just yours. It could be your communities. It could be your countries. It could be global in aspiration.
That reminds me of a quote from Brian Arthur from the Santa Fe Institute. He says that traditional scientists don't like complexity because complexity are open-ended. And so there are recurring patterns that never close. And so it's this nature of the fractal nature of the past and the future, and they are patterns of one another.
Yeah.
This is this idea of working within complexity. You talked about modeling the future and testing and iterating, and this touches on some of the thinking around complexity science. How have you guys been influenced by people like Brian Arthur or Stuart Kauffman, and this thinking around cybernetics and complexity? How has it influenced your guys' work because it really was future-focused work in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, it was very unheard of. Now it's becoming more part of the common lexicon. How has that thinking around complexity and cybernetics influenced your work?
Well, there's really 3 parts of that. There's us working together since the 70s and through the 40 years that we have been professionally working with organizations to reconceive their future, and individually. I got very engaged in the late 50s, early 60s to cybernetics and systems theory. And that was very new at that time. So it was very exciting. And there were lots of people that were experimenting, building new models, testing, and that was a really exciting time. And so I had that base. Gail, she can cover her part, but she was in education and very realizing that when you educate a child, your product is delivered 20, 30 years later when that is an adult that has influence in the community of people. And so we were in it early. When we were in a mature state with our work, that's really when the explosion of systems theory and Future and Santa Fe Institute and things like that was erupting. And that's where science was breaking out. For a long period, cybernetics and systems kind of sat there and nothing happened. But then suddenly, in that period of time of Santa Fe Institute being formed, there was a huge eruption of, and that's when our toolkit about thinking about the future really got filled in.
Mm.
And for me, as Matt said, future is, raising kids and how do I prepare them for an unknown future, and what do I need to learn about possibilities and potential that can help me inspire the kids. I also, from a very early age, heard that all life's a relationship, all life is connected. And I've been fascinated with that most of my life and working to understand what that means. Mm. So that's driven me to find people like Stu Kaufman and others who have opened up my world for me and given me some clues as to what that means. And I think today with the virus, it's certainly affecting all of us. And suddenly all of us are seeing what it means to be in relationship, not only with each other, but all species and Mother Earth. And it's a very interesting time for me to watch what's happening right now.
What are some of the observations that you've had in these last weeks as now North America starts to deal with the coronavirus? What are some of the things you've seen?
How fast we can come together when we want to, or when crisis tells us to come together, and how incredibly fast we can come together, how innovative we can be. Today in Northern California, all the maker spaces that were created 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that have been kind of hanging around are now all creating masks. They're all, developing for us. And it's like, we're all in this together. We are all in this together. We are related. Everything is happening. You stand six feet apart from each other, which is different. And still we're in relationship with each other. So I think it's, we can see it. I can see it. I can feel it. I can feel that we're acknowledging. And
in 6 months, 6 years from today, what are some of the big lessons or patterns you would like to see reoccurring from our experience of now?
Well, I think one of the things that Gail has talked about over the last few days is that this is an extraordinary time in the fact that the whole globe very much is having a singular experience, is having the same experience. And we have the technology that they're sharing it. There's been, as we all know, horrible plagues and stuff in the past, but that happened in Europe and here and there. Now this is global, and people know it's global, and they know everyone's going through it. So that creates a new framework that just hasn't been common, and so that's kind of point one. The second point is we'll learn, I think, a lot of things about how did we track this in time? Were we paying attention to the weak signals? If we had jumped on it sooner, could have we done a better job? What's it like when it starts to get away for people? And how do we feel about that? And even though now a lot of us are away from people and not interacting with them, it's kind of interesting when you go out to the grocery store and keeping 6 feet apart, you have to pay attention.
Right.
You just can't just blast by someone like they're a walking post. And so there's a tension there. And what's going on the internet and with Zoom and people finding how they can continue their work. So in a strange way, separated, which for humans we discover and remember is not something we like. But being separated, we're finding what we're actually becoming more connected in a different kind of way. And the question is, will we remember and carry what we're learning when this crisis goes away? Because there's other crises, including ones we're creating for ourselves.
I think there's one more thing, and that is that we, the people, haven't had much choice in politics. I mean, we say we live in a democracy and the democracies, but basically it's been a few people who have made most of the decisions for us. And this is the first time that we, the people, have had this experience together. And that our politicians are saying, we have to help the people, not just big government. I mean, Ryan told me today that Canada has decided that they're going to give $2,000 to every citizen for the next 4 months. Now that means that they have respect for their citizens, and they know that the citizens are going to spend money where it needs to be spent and do things. So the question, I think for the first time, we have an opportunity to engage with the politicians, to say we're part of designing the future and creating the future.
But I think this does take us to a little bit about what happens then.
Yeah.
What happens now that we are starting, or at least admitting, that the militarization of space? What happens when certain things in the universe say that we get hit with some rather large pieces of old broken up planets and stuff that occasionally land around here, and that hits an industrial area or a high area? What happens when we invent capabilities that puts 50, 60, 70% of the people out of what we call work, and they don't now have permission to be because they're not earning an income? So there's a lot good, negative, positive and negative and unknown trends now coming out of our existing thing that we do not have the means to dialogue about, think about, anticipate, model, and design better responses to. It isn't a very good strategy to get hit over the head and then think, gee, I should have ducked.
There's when you were mentioning, you talked about the global relationship that we have, so that we are all in this together, and it gets me thinking of the power and symbolism of triads and triangles, the most powerful natural structure, right? The triad, and that power of three. In theater, a young actor is taught. Not in American, traditional American psychological theater, but in physical theater, what I worked in when working with Cirque du Soleil and more contemporary forms of physical device theater, is that you're always in a relationship of three: yourself, the person you're playing with, and the audience. And we're always in that continuous relationship with one another. Now, I noticed that in the conversations that we're having, that as we think to the future, I'm reminded of a quote from one of the books, Reconstructing the Universe. What is it called again? It is called, Beginner's Guide to Constructing the Universe, written by Michael Schneider. There's a quote there that he takes, is that a force without wisdom falls on its own weight. And this was taken from Horace in the early, before 8 BC, is that two opposing forces, so that inertia, forces of physics, it needs a third. If not, it folds in on itself. And when we talk about what happens then, the question there that we have is, we have ourselves, the government, corporations, but also the rest of the world. Now, there is always a relationship of three. What is, for you guys, as we move forward, what is that relationship of three? Who should we be focusing on other than ourselves and our immediate environments? What's the next step?
Well, one of the models that we use, we call the transition manager. And we don't mean manager in the top-down sense. It's a role, it's a transition process. And whenever you have these times of conflicts or differences, or even two very benign trends or organizations or people coming together to do something new, you need a transition manager process that is neutral, that has a foot in both worlds, understanding and competency in those worlds, to help people plan and model and move forward, whether they're blending those or moving from one reality to another reality. And we do not have those kinds of trained and neutral in the sense of fiduciary duty people that are helping transitions. And so we tend to get into it, cause pain and suffering and conflict, and then try to negotiate a peaceful or a better outcome. Our habit is first to fight or collide or ignore or forget. And then when the crisis gets bad enough, we then start to heal. We need to avoid these kinds of unnecessary crises. This is not good management of a person, a community, or a planet, because we are dealing now with forces that literally could destroy this planet.
That's an interesting idea. This transition manager is someone who's in the liminal space, in between two. I pull back to my theater reference, is that we say that the actor is merely a conduit between the two metaphysical states. So the metaphysical state of the imagination that's being conjured on the stage, and the metaphysical state in the audience's mind of they fill in with their own blanks. A bad actor shows too much. Ziami, one of the no theaters from 600 AD, said that if in your heart you feel 10, you only show 7. Yeah. Because you let the audience fill in the rest.
Wow.
And as a facilitator or somebody working in the transition or change management environment, there's an importance that we do not show or explain everything, and that we allow the two binary forces, if they are perhaps the client or the expertise of the consulting environment, whatever we want to conflict to, let's say, Protestants and Catholics, which just to illustrate, you cannot tell them what to do. You can only set conditions.
Yes.
Right? And that is happening in the liminal space where they are able to see and make their own connections and patterns.
Yeah. And
perhaps transition towards something moving forward. In your guys' work, you've often been that person where there's a great story in the book Leaping the Abyss, where I think it was a union and another worker, where they said, well, if we'll do that, then we'll never have an argument again. And there's a dead silence in the room. Remember that story? Could you give a bit of color on that and that role that you played as a transition manager, if at all?
Yeah, it's a long story, but the short of it is that we were doing a design shop in the union. This was it was at AEDC. And there was a union conflict with management, and what had happened was that at Christmas time there was people actually were burning cars and raiding offices, and people were getting hurt. It was actually, for a situation like this, a totally impossible and unuseful response. And so they finally kludged together a union, a contract so they could get back to work. But we brought 75 union people and 75 people from the military and also all the contractors, and we brought them together. And we were in the first day of the design shop, and we had at one point there was a conversation going on after people had worked on teams. And one of the union head, who was a Boilermaker, and he looked like a Boilermaker, he was a big, strong person, and he was many union people who were involved in many design shops we did there. And he's just a terrific person. And he looked over at the senior business manager who's his union had struck. And he said, "Do you realize what case you put us in, what condition you put us in?" They were put in a position where they didn't have any maneuvering room. And the manager said, "Yes, I realize it." And he said, "Will you tell me that you'll never do that again?" And he said, "Well, no, I'll never do that again." And then the union leader said, and this is what blew the room, "Then we will never strike again." And the room just went silent. And I realized this was the epitome. We had this in the bag now. And I said, "Okay, great. Well, let's see, we have a few minutes before going home. Let's do this and this and this, and be back tomorrow at 8:00 and such and such." And they left. And then all of the knowledge workers who were from the base, who had experienced this, said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "We are going to have a funeral." A theater, but a funeral. Long story short, it came in the beginning. I was standing in front of this big curved radiant wall, and I was just sort of saying a few things, and this masked figure came around, and the music roared up. And what happened is Death came out with a quill pen and had them all sign the end of the strike of last year. And then they thought, "Whew," and then out came a little casket that had been built overnight, had a nice purple thing in it, and a beautiful axe, brand new shiny axe, hatchet with a thing, hatchet, and then they all had to come up, and then a priest came out and talked about the hatchet, who's so wonderful, but it could be used to hurt as well as to build, and then they all had to come up individually. It turned out. And drive a little nail when we put the top on, a little nail into the hatchet, drive a nail into the drive a nail. And then I said, "Oh boy, and I'm glad this is over." And then we all went out, and there was this black car that had a little thing on the back, put the hatchet on it, and we all walked with the military police leading the way all the way out to a piece of ground by the entry, shovels, dug a grave, threw flowers on it. We had paper, sang the music.
So the power of ritual.
Ritual and metaphor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that sealed emotionally.
Yeah.
And that union for years, on the day of the anniversary, would play the videotape of that. It was all video, and laugh and say, "Joe, did you see your hand was shaking when you signed that?" And so it made it real.
Yeah.
Right. And that comes back to this idea of the liminal and transition, aiding in the transition. But as we start to wrap up now, I have one or two more questions I want to drive us towards. One of these things is, as we say, what happens then? There's an idea that we are in the moment of now, but we know that we're working for now for the future. And one of my teachers once said to me that, "Why do we go on stage? Why do we do theater?" He says, "I do it for my grandparents and for my grandchildren." And that we are in this liminal space of time. Now, there's a question that you asked Gail once that I think is core, and perhaps we can start to close on this, is what can we do and how may we become good ancestors?
We become good ancestors by being aware and waking up to being alive and on this earth. And that we have the choice to be aware, to create an agency that can pass on, and a longer framework than me. And I mean, Matt and I are 80 now, and we're looking at what is our legacy? What is it that we have, that we are gifting to the future? And I think about that a lot in terms of my own, not an ancestor necessarily to my grandkids, but to life, to the trees outside, to the animals, to all life as being good ancestors. And I believe that all species are awakening as we're awakening to our potential. Animals are also awakening to what's happening with humans. I mean, this is metaphysical, of course, but I watch for signals and I watch for signs, and I see how animals just like us are now making friends across different breeds, and they're finding friendships with people, with animals very unlike them, and they're mixing with humans in different ways. So I'm not sure I'm answering this, but I think that just being aware that we are stewards of the future of ourselves, our communities, our world can help this. And right now, I think there's a lot of stewardship going on in this virus, this very critical time right now. Our higher self is coming out and showing up and creating a higher order of understanding of who we are as humans and what our potential is.
And our responsibility.
And our stewardship and responsibility.
We don't own this planet.
No.
We don't have the right to just ride roughshod over all life just because it's convenient for us. It's not necessary. And so we have to start to be transition managers for life on this planet, not just what serves my particular interests today and what's the shortcut that makes it possible for me to just do what I feel like.
With that, we're out of time. Thank you very much for the conversation. Is there any last word as we think forward, we say, and what happens then? Is there any last word that you would give to our listeners, people who are watching and listening?
You know, what happens then, the title came from a quote that Matt and I both read 30 or 40 years ago, about someday not too far in the future, we would be riding our motorcycle, we would ride our personal computers with all the excitement that the motorcycle rider feels when he storms down the highway. And, you know, this was written in 1967 and well before the internet or well before any of us had computers except for maybe the biggest organizations. And so to read that and then see along the way, it was one of our weak signal research, to see along the way how he was absolutely right with his poetry, his story. It's a story. It's not a prediction of a particular.
Yeah, it was definitely a weak signal. This idea that we could see that our personal computers will become the conduits to our imagination, and we'd be able to make that leap. Yeah. Matt, any last words?
I'll pick up on the last word you used, imagination. that is the most important thing that we have to all express and share and fight over, argue over, laugh over, and also to pay attention to the fantastic body of knowledge on this planet that already has made numerous thousands of models predicting the time we're in and predicting the times that we may be moving to.
Yeah.
And we should pay attention to that.
Just one more point. Today, science fiction is so dystopian. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, when we were reading, it had a lot of excitement to it. Of course, it had the good guys and the bad guys, but it was positive. It's low-hanging fruit to create dystopian models, in my mind. It's easy to create the negative. It's our imagination which brings the flowering of potential and positive futures with us. And we're not lacking for imagination. We just need to wake it up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice rest of the day, and take care.
You too. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Be sure to check out the next interview in the Leaping the Abyss series, Crisis as Opportunity, with Elizabeth Sahtouris. You can also find more information on each podcast by visiting bodyofknowledge.online.